It's Monday, December 12th, 2022, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast exploring social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a Hoover Distinguished Policy Fellow. I'll be your moderator today, joined as usual by our three wise men, our GoodFellows, as we call them. That would include the historian Niall Ferguson, the economist John Cochrane, the geostrategist Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. They are Hoover Institution senior fellows all. Guys, this is our last episode for 2022. We're about to go on a break here at Hoover, so our viewers should know we'll be back at some point early in 2023. So let's spend the next hour or so talking about what happened in 2022, but also cast an eye on 2023. Neil, I'd like to begin with you. Is it so obvious that Ukraine and Russia is the story of the year? If not, then what is? But rather than kind of discuss why it's the story of the year, maybe we should talk more about what will happen with that engagement in 2023.
Well, I don't think it could be anything else, just as you couldn't really put anyone else on the cover of Time magazine as person of the year than Volodymyr Zelensky. Funnily enough, I had a conversation with someone quite senior in that institution, trying, as it seemed, to find somebody else because it seemed too obvious. And I said, sometimes the obvious is right. And the only alternative suggestion that I had was to put the Ukrainian people rather than Zelensky on the front of Time, because really the amazing thing that happened in 2022 was that Ukraine didn't fold, that Ukraine turned out to be much stronger than almost anybody had realized and much more united. And as my friend Slava Vakarchuk, the Ukrainian singer, said to me, whoever had been president would have had to do that, would have had to channel that patriotism, that determination not to submit. So that's, I think, the big story. When you look ahead to next year, though, I think you have to feel a certain unease about where this could go and what we might be saying 12 months from now. Because although the battle has clearly swung in Ukraine's favor this year, the Ukrainian economy is in a parlous state, a much weaker state than the Russian economy. And of course, the Russians have engaged in a partial mobilization that means they will have more soldiers to throw into this reenactment of World War I in the course of probably by the spring of 2023. And right at the beginning, I remember discussing with some eminent historians of Russia the parallel with the Winter War of 1939-40, in the first phase of which Finland kicked the Red Army's backside, inflicted extraordinary casualties on the Soviets. But ultimately, Finland was overwhelmed the following year by Soviet might. And I think there's a very important lesson there for supporters of Ukraine. They must not keep fighting this war beyond the point at which they can maintain the upper hand, because then I fear the sheer scale of Russian resources and power could turn the tide against them. I don't know if HR, you agree with that, but it's my big fear for next year.
I think an analogy that we could also use would be the Montenegrin-Ottoman War in the late 19th century, when the Ottomans should have had overwhelming force to crush the Montenegrins, but the Montenegrins demonstrated a tremendous will and perseverance. And I just think that when you look at what Russia is doing to mobilize, there's just no way that they can generate the combat power to subjugate Ukraine overall, but I think to even go on the offensive again. So I feel better about Ukraine's prospects from a military perspective, but you're quite right. I mean, the support for the Ukrainians must be sustained, and it has to include economic and financial support as well. And I think back to the show that we did with Stephen Cochrane when he said that he gave us the equation for sustained European, American, other support for the Ukrainians, and he used the equation of Ukrainian will plus Russian atrocities equals sustained support. And I think that's true. But as you mentioned, as we go into next year, you already see some of these arguments, right? That we have to force some kind of a negotiated settlement. I think that would be a huge mistake. But I think that the sustained support for the Ukrainians is a contested issue in the next year.
Let me give my short version of it too, because you guys are the experts on this. I also want to celebrate the bravery of ordinary Ukrainians. That's just who went out and stopped Russian tanks on their way to Kiev. Wow, that was amazing. As well, of course, Zelensky being brilliant at channeling that. Good news here also was that the West did not cave as we were expected to. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan really set Putin's expectations up that we would just give up quickly. And to some extent, there's the waking up of the West, both of our Europe especially, of our need for security and some of the horrible self-inflicted wounds on energy policy is a big piece of news. The question being, are we going to finish this off? I like Boris Johnson's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Really, the Ukrainians are going to fight hard, but I think, unless you guys disagree with me, a lot of the outcome of this depends on what weapons we give them. Do we give them the weapons and the financial support, which is not big in dollar terms, they need to finish this off this summer and not let this turn into an eternal quagmire and the negotiated end, which would be terrible for the U.S. and the West for that end. So really, to some extent, it depends on the Ukrainians' ability, but the Ukrainians' ability to fight depends also a lot on whether we supply them with the weapons they need. I'm never going to win on historical analogies with you guys, but it's always struck me the first Iraq War was an important historical analogy. This shall not stand. Push it back to the borders. That's it. I thought that was the right policy to start with, and I hope that we, the West, discover that's the right policy now and the right thing that we want our children and grandchildren to have everyone in the world remembering.
If we agree that Ukraine is the story of the year, then let's talk about what deserves honorable mention. Let me throw three topics at you. One's inflation, John Cochrane. Second one is cryptocurrency, Niall Ferguson. And the third one is social media, today, by the way, being the fifth installment of the Twitter files.
So the big surprise, maybe not a surprise, depending where you stand, is inflation. 10%. I think it's fairly clear where it came from. Our government's handed out immense amounts. The U.S. government, about $5 trillion, basically printed money, gave it to people. No surprise we have inflation. And there's not much the Fed could have done about that, though now it's being asked to mop up a little bit. Where will it go? Economists are always one hand, the other hand. My guess, based on the models I play with, is that it does ease for a while, but then it's going to go on for a long time until something happens, either good or bad. The bad thing, many of the forces that push inflation can wake up again. More fiscal blowouts, bad news in the world elsewhere, and the sorts of things that push inflation down could happen too. Our countries are all starting to wake up that money doesn't grow on trees and that responsible long-term fiscal policy is important. If that change of will happens, I think inflation could go down. My best guess is it's going to look like 1975, which is easing of inflation, and then we hit sort of the hard question around 4 or 5%.
Well, I'm going to be quick because we've decided under John's direction to do 3 by 3. The inflation surprise for those people who back in February of last year thought it would be transitory is that we still have inflation way above target. Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised because I can remember last year when Larry Summers was publishing his op-ed in the Washington Post being one of the few people who agreed with him. And I, like John, think it will be very difficult indeed for inflation to come down as much as the Federal Reserve says it will. It'll come down. It's highly unlikely to remain at the current levels for some fairly predictable reasons. But the problem is the target's still supposed to be an average of 2%, which means it'll have to be well below 2% for that target to be met. The truth is the target's dead. And before long, economists will be clamoring, not John, I'm sure, but others, to raise the inflation target. Why not 3? Oh, why not 4?
They already are.
By the time you get into that discussion, which I'm already hearing, even from Olivier Blanchard, as well as the inevitable Paul Krugman, the public is going to say, well, you see, we were right. Our expectations of inflation were correct. The experts were full of baloney with transitory inflation, and now they show their true colors. I think the problem is going to be that expectations are going to remain elevated, and if they change the target, that's only going to confirm public fears. So I'll be amazed if the Fed hits the target it has, which last time I looked was that inflation would be coming down towards 2% by the end of the year or beginning of 2024. Dream on, Jay Powell. I'm sure I've said it on the show before, but I'll say it again. I knew Paul Volcker. He's no Paul Volcker.
Thank you, Lloyd Benson. HR, you want to jump in on this one?
Okay, hey, washed up generals should speak sparingly about the economy. So I'm not going to talk about that.
You're not washed up. So
I will talk about just crypto. Just one other dimension of it is the security dimension, which I've always been concerned about, and the degree to which, crypto, if it's not regulated, could provide a way for criminals to move money. Of course, we've seen the impact that crypto had on cyber attacks, for example. And so I think that's an important aspect of this as we get to, policies on a digital currency and so forth, that we have to build in the security dimension, which, I think that this was an advertisement, this collapse of this company and the theft of billions of dollars is a cry for some form of regulation. And then on Twitter, what I'm really concerned about there is the security dimension as well, the impact on individuals associated with polarization and extreme content, the degree to which the algorithms present people with more and more extreme content that pulls us apart from one another in our society. But as we're seeing, more and more can have a devastating impact on individuals, especially adolescents and children. And so I'm all for some of the measures that Neil has advocated for in the past, removing some of the legal protections so they have to police themselves more, publishing the algorithms. And Neil, you had an excellent paper on this, I think 3 years ago. And what else do you think is necessary? I'm following what Tristan Harris is doing, for example, at the Institute for Responsible Technology. Neil, what are the few things you think we can do that there would be broad support for?
Well, this is a great question to revisit. It's 5 years now since the publication of the Square and the Tower, which I think correctly identified that a huge problem had arisen with the rise of the network platforms, companies like Google as well as Facebook and Twitter. And these network platforms centralized the internet with astonishing speed. And as I pointed out in that book, gave huge power to the people running those companies. One of the follow-up arguments that I made in that book was that in many ways, the network platforms, particularly Facebook, had helped Donald Trump win in 2016. And in the wake of that result, they collectively vowed it would not happen again. What the Twitter files are revealing is the extent to which the people running Twitter prior to Elon Musk's takeover were using their power over that platform to engage in a quite deliberate strategy of politically motivated censorship. They may not have used the term shadow banning, but that's exactly what they were doing in another name. Now, it's obviously a problem that the First Amendment does not constrain a private entity like Twitter for engaging in that kind of behavior. On the other hand, if the public sphere is entirely dominated by a small number of network platforms in private ownership, it's hard to see quite how free speech can flourish. I think this is the issue that the Twitter files are forcing us to confront. Notice also that as these reports of broken are published by journalists like Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss, the New York Times and the BBC basically ignore the story and pretend it's not there. There's almost no coverage of these revelations, which I think is illustrative of the fundamental problem. So I think we are a long way from solving this. I still think Section 230 is a part of the problem. That's a piece of legislation that has given enormous power to network platforms without any of the responsibility that publishers have to shoulder. And I still think reform of that section of legislation would be a step in the right direction. But I'm not naive enough to think that that would solve the whole problem. And nor am I naive enough to think that Elon Musk can solve the problem by some of the changes that he's making at Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Let me add some both crypto and Twitter comments together. The collapse of FTX really didn't have that much to do with crypto or with regulation. This was a good old-fashioned fraud, using customers' money to prop up your proprietary trading, no accounting standards, no risk management, no whatever. To the extent it's regulatory, there's this puzzle that if you say a coin is worth something, then it's a security and you get regulated. If you say it's totally worthless, then you're allowed much laxer regulation, especially if you move the whole thing to the Bahamas But I actually liked Elizabeth Warren's op-ed on it, where if you read between the lines, she points out there's plenty of rules. They just weren't applied in this case. The story in here on regulation is the sort of egregious way in which regulators were paying no attention to it whatsoever. But it really isn't a story about crypto. It's a story about financial intermediation. It's not a story about blockchain. If blockchain were working, people would be buying crypto directly, not through exchanges. This is a fundamental problem, of course. Crypto as tokens that are inherently worthless is eventually going to fall. I'm glad to see that's happening. Crypto as a way of implementing backed and proper securities remains an interesting proposition. It's still not clear quite what is the question to which it's the answer, but we are seeing, for example, getting money into Ukraine. Crypto is very useful for that, and better crypto will be used for that. Getting money into Venezuela and out of China, crypto will remain useful. So this isn't really the end of crypto. It is, to one extent, the end. It's the end of the Silicon Valley, the genius who doesn't dress right and who plays video games while pitching Sequoia for $1 billion. A lot of that has been exposed for the rot.
You really think it's the end of that, John?
Well, we'll see. But I think a combination of the rise in interest rates and these scandals, Theranos, SBF, is I think bringing some sanity to that. Which relates to Twitter. Of course, the political censorship is all over the news. But I just got through Twitter, which, by the way, is a great way to find out about what's going on with Twitter, what's going on with crypto, what's going on with AI, and so forth. Twitter remains a great way of learning about these things. Today's Twitter feed that I saw is the one no one's paying attention. Apparently, in those files, Twitter's security was absolutely awful. Twitter's security protocols looked about the same as SBF and FTX's accounting protocols. Incredibly lax. 5,000 employees had access to anything they want. At one point, they were completely unbacked up, total chaos. So it's interesting to see that in Twitter as well as in crypto. A lot of organizations we think are well run turn out to be very rotten on the inside.
And this gets back to the kind of consumer demand, right? If a company is going to hold your data, you want them to regard that data as gold and the company as Fort Knox, right? And quite the opposite was the case here with Twitter. And Frank, quite the opposite is the case with TikTok as well, where customers are willingly giving their data to the Chinese Communist Party. So I mean, this will continue to be a big topic for us, I think, in the next year.
But let me just put in one thing, a note in favor of the leveraged buyout and for-profit companies that a big gazillionaire can come buy up all the shares and expose what's going on in them. That is a mechanism for bringing things down to earth, which is usually disparaged around Washington. But
and I'll tell you, it's pretty entertaining, with all the snowflakes melting into Twitter when Musk came in. I mean, I've just got to tell you, I've chuckled a little bit about this ever since he walked in there with the sink and so forth.
Right. Somebody listening is probably thinking, why on earth did they scramble together those three topics? And what was John Cochrane thinking when he tried to get everybody to talk about all three? But you have to realize, dear viewer and listener, they're connected. Because if the Fed had not raised rates the way that it did, then all the leveraged players in crypto would not have been exposed in the way that ultimately blew up Sam Bankman-Fried's scam. Without the tightening of rates, I don't think the bubble would have burst. Almost every bubble in history has burst because of a change in the monetary environment. And at the same time, the story of SBF and FTX's antics was not broken by the Wall Street Journal. It was not broken by the New York Times. The best coverage of the whole scandal was on Twitter, no question. So these three things are interrelated in a really complex way.
Neil, you mentioned Volodymyr Zelensky being Times Man of the Year. I'd like you to name someone else you found particularly compelling in 2022. Doesn't have to be someone famous or in the news, just someone who's kind of an extension of your work or your play. I thought about this myself. Mahsa Amini came to mind. Jimmy Lai, who was just sentenced to 5 years, 9 months in prison yesterday by the Chinese, comes to mind. But who would you say is a compelling figure in the non-Zelensky category?
It's very hard not to think about football if you are in World Cup world. And the cult of Lionel Messi is one of the most extraordinary things that I've witnessed in my life. I just was in Argentina, And it taught me something very important, and that is that you can have a religious experience around a sporting event. Now, we take football seriously in Scotland, no question, but we don't come close to the Argentines, who worship their star player, Leo Messi, in a way that I don't think I've ever really seen in modern times. In fact, I think they feel a much greater reverence towards him than the Ukrainians feel towards President Zelensky. So I come from Buenos Aires realizing that I haven't fully understood the meaning of the famous Scottish manager Bill Shankly's observation that football wasn't a matter of life and death. It was far more important than that. In Argentina, it is a religion. And Messi occupies this almost godlike status. They almost carry icons of Messi around in the street. And it will be truly painful for them when Croatia win on penalties, as inevitably will be happening later this week.
So it's a short distance from Messi to Messiah, is what you're saying. John, who caught your attention?
Exactly.
Well, if we're gonna, I'll keep the football analogy going. Soccer, football, whatever you want to call it. The video of, and I'm sorry I forget the name, the U.S. player gently hugging the losing Iranian. That brought the real HR to my mind. That tells you something about what's really going on with people in the world. That was one of the most heartwarming moments of the whole year. And following Twitter, maybe we should nominate Elon Musk for Disruptor of the Year. It may have cost him $44 billion, but we're all learning some lessons. So thanks, Elon, for all the money.
Okay, Charlie.
Hey, on Messi, I highly recommend Wright Thompson's essay on Messi. And by the way, just read anything Wright Thompson writes. He's the best sports writer of his generation, but he's also written on a broad range of other topics. He's just an elegant, compelling writer. But I'll go with Mahsa Amini and also all things related to Iran. I think the image, John, that you're talking about is extremely important. I think it's important really on U.S.-Iran relations, but to bolster the Iranians who are protesting. I think just like Zelensky is to the Ukrainian people, as Mahsa Amini, I think, is to the Iranian people, and the tremendous courage that they've demonstrated in standing up to the theocratic dictatorship. But I think what the World Cup comes out of the World Cup, I think with these competitions, is that we have more in common across humanity than we have differences. I think we talk so often about what separates us, what divides us. And of course the trend toward identity politics and categorizing everybody and organizing people on a strata of oppressor to victimhood is ridiculous. And so I think that the World Cup is powerful to me because you just see people come together based on their common love for the sport and their affection for one another across cultural boundaries.
I'm surprised you guys didn't bring up Xi Jinping and China's dramatic turnaround. It was only, a week ago that we were saying China's stuck in zero COVID forever. Couple protests and look, I need some comment from my good fellows on this one.
This was one of the most remarkable events of 2022, because it seemed as if in the wake of the party congress, Xi Jinping's grip on power was completely unlimited. And yet, a relatively small number of protests. It wasn't as if a vast throng of students gathered in the Tsinghua campus seems to have sufficed to blow him off course and to abandon the zero COVID policy. We are still waiting with bated breath to see what comes next. In fact, only a few restrictions have in practice been lifted. But mention of zero COVID has entirely ceased in official Chinese Communist Party circles. And the evidence is hard to trace because the statistics on cases and on deaths are almost entirely unreliable now. So we're having to track things like mobility. Remember how we used to do that in the early stages of the pandemic in the US? Judging by mobility data, something's going very wrong in Beijing. There must be a great surge of infections there. On the basis of what happened in Hong Kong back in the spring of this year, there's going to be a huge wave of COVID that sweeps through a pretty poorly vaccinated elderly population and kills a great many of them. People have been estimating numbers above 1 million. This is all, it seems, because Xi Jinping took fright in the face of the kind of protests that through Chinese history have often been very historically significant. Protests by students, protests in Beijing, and we have yet to see if he's going to get away with it. In one scenario, it's a public health disaster that damages the legitimacy of the party just as much as zero COVID itself. But I hear other China experts saying, no, this is exactly what happened elsewhere. There was a great spike in infections and deaths, and then life resumed as normal, and that's what's going to happen in China. China's going to boom in 2023. John, I wish I knew which it's going to be, but it's one of the huge questions of next year.
Neil, let's stick with you. Big story in 2023 in the non-Zelensky, maybe non-COVID category.
The most irritating and yet completely inescapable story of this year is ChatGPT, yes. The AI, your AI conversation buddy. I mean, basically, ChatGPT is like the most annoying kid you went to school with, who knew the answer to everything, no matter what you asked him or her. It's sort of Hermione Granger from the Harry Potter books on your laptop, and everybody, including everybody on Twitter, is obsessively playing with ChatGPT. And at some level, it's fascinating to see artificial intelligence deliver at this level. I mean, it's capable of writing a plausible essay. I asked it just before we went on air to do a retrospective on 2022 in the style of Niall Ferguson, and it did quite well. Though it seemed to me that it could equally well have been in the style of Name Anyone. It was pretty generic, and it crashed before it got to the contrarian conclusion that I was hoping for. But it can churn out extraordinarily plausible essays, answers to questions. It's of course fallible because it's AI. What does it do? It takes vast quantities of data and it uses these large language technologies to infer plausible answers. And of course they're plausible, but they're not always right. And John can probably give some examples of how you catch it out. One of the best things about it, it's going to kill the college essay, and so American teenagers will no longer have to perjure themselves by writing tremendously fabulistic essays about their desire to save the world, because it'll be too obviously the work of ChatGPT. But I'm already bored of it. I wish it didn't exist, and it annoys me just as much as Hermione Granger annoys Ron Weasley in the Harry Potter books.
So, Alec, this is a transformative moment. Now, it's also a great example of Twitter. Where do you learn about ChatGPT? Go on Twitter. All of my economist friends took the week off and started playing ChatGPT 3 and pointing out what it does. Now, it's very good. What it does, it takes the huge body of a language and puts snippets back together again, and it sounds incredibly plausible, which may tell us something about human language and how little intelligence actually we're representing when we speak. It's bad at logic. And the best example was somebody who asked it, which is heavier, 16 kilos of feathers or 16 kilos of iron? And ChatGPT-3 proudly pronounced that 16 kilos of iron was heavier. Because, of course, it just takes what people say and puts it back together again. And it isn't, for the moment, really connected to fact or logic basis. So I think that will improve quickly. Which leads to, so where's it going to go? That depends, garbage in, garbage out is the old theory of software. I wonder what happens once chat starts digesting its own language as the training module. I did see somebody else give it an IQ test. It got about 83. It passes, however, the bar. It gets about 70% on the bar exam. So it's doing pretty well there. It is going to change all sorts of things that are based on language. Marginal Revolution has a great list of things that are going to completely change with ChatGPT-3, and some for the better, some for the worse. Phishing is going to get really, really good. So if your ability to detect is an email true or false is going to be hard. It pointed out comments to regulatory agencies in Congress are going to be overwhelmed by plausible sounding individual ChatGPT-3. So all sorts of systems like that are going to be completely broken by this ability to produce very plausible sounding language. So a big thing coming.
All right, HR, you're an author. You're working on a book right now. Niall Ferguson is writing a book. John Cochrane writes books and blogs. All of you, the English language is very important to all of you. I'd like you to give me one word or one phrase you'd like to see retired in 2023. HR, why don't you start?
Hey, how about the word robust? I mean, it just bugs the heck out of me. And one of the reasons it is because it's just part of what I would call policy pablum that comes out of Washington. And then just in general, I would say just eliminating superfluous adjectives and throughout these documents. I mean, I read the National Defense Strategy, and it's just full of unnecessary words that cloud understanding. And then also, maybe also the clause seeking to, just do it. Stop seeking to do something. Just do it. So I mean, there's a lot about language in Washington, D.C. that irritates the hell out of me.
All right, John Cochrane, what would you like to retire from the English language?
I would like to pass a constitutional amendment against the passive voice. Every sentence must have a subject. We must know who we're talking about. Usually it's the federal government, but we don't say it.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Neil?
I wish I could get people to say going forward as if we had the option to go back in time. But if there's a redundant phrase that gets overused, especially at meetings in the United States, it's going forward. I mean, time goes forward by definition. I mean, speaking as an historian, I can tell you, we really don't have the option to go back. Even on GoodFellows, we can do second takes, but we can't turn the clock back. So stop saying going forward. You're going forward all the time. That's the human condition.
And Neil, as a cavalry officer, I agree completely with that. I mean, there's no sense in going backward ever.
Okay, Neil, let's stick with you. One thing of importance that you got right in 2022. There's a 10-minute time limit on this one.
Well, I'm not going to blow my own trumpet for 10 minutes. On January the 2nd, I wrote the first column of the year. Its opening words were, "War is coming." I rest my case.
Okay. HR?
Yeah, I think all of us recognizing that the Ukraine war was going to happen, right? That it wasn't a black swan. It's what Frank Hoffman calls a pink flamingo. It's right there. It's right there in front of you. But I guess also from the very beginning, you'll remember that I thought Russia was going to fail from the outset, and the main reason for that was I thought the Russian military was overrated. The Ukrainian army was underrated, and I just looked at the scale on the map and looked at the size of their forces, and there's no way in hell they could have pulled it off, unless this coup de main had worked. The assassinations and the seizure of the airport. But I think that it was predictable that Russia was going to invade. It was also quite predictable that they would fail as well.
Okay, John, one thing you got right. I think both you and Neil saw inflation coming a mile away.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got to take inflation. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I submitted a book manuscript about 1.5 years ago that said if you print $5 trillion of money and give it to people, you'll get inflation. And the federal government is just really helping my book sales tremendously. So thank you.
Now, I got a lot of things wrong in 2022. There was the wave election I thought was coming did not pan out. I thought Aaron Judge was a fool to turn down a 7-year, $213 million contract. It turns out he got 9 years, $360 million. HR, one thing you got wrong in 2022.
I thought the Phillies were going to win it all. They came close, but that's what I'm disappointed. I was wrong about it too.
Okay, Neil.
I thought Joe Biden would be more like Jimmy Carter this year than he has been. And, you mentioned the wave election that never was.
Right. That
was an exceptionally strong performance for a party with a man in the White House. And the man in the White House is part of the reason. Mm-hmm. Some of my younger colleagues at Greenmantle love to taunt me about this. They have the Dark Brandon meme on. They sometimes put it as their background on Zoom. I don't know if any of you have been following the Dark Brandon saga, but it went from the "Let's go Brandon" chant being turned on its head, with Biden reappearing as a sort of meme lord with red laser eyes. So I think I was wrong. I think I underestimated Joe Biden's political effectiveness, and so passed the crow.
All right, John Cochrane, surely there's one thing you got wrong in 2022.
Yes. First, two things I got wrong. and I'm happy. Well, the first I'm happy about. I thought there'd be a lot more of a red wave, that people saw what's going on in Washington and held their noses and said, well, these individuals might not be great, but I want a different set of institutions. And I'm glad I was wrong. I think America came to pretty much just the right answer, which is Republicans have to earn the right to govern. We're not just going to throw them out. So I think we're in a good place, and I'm glad I was wrong about that. I also thought that the European energy business would quickly undo a lot of the complete crazy side of the climate obsession. But certainly U.S. and much European energy policy, the organizing principle of the progressive left is becoming more and more climate catastrophism, and it's still working very hard, a little bit under the scenes in all of our federal agencies and in much of Europe. So it's a resilience in the face of facts slapping it in the face surprised me.
So I was recently on a long plane ride and used up the time reading Bob Dylan's The Philosophy of Modern Song. It's Dylan examining 65 songs and their importance in the world of music. The question to the panel, the best book that you read in 2022. HR, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I want to recommend a book probably nobody's heard of by a visiting fellow at Hoover, Jakob Griegel, Classics and Strategy. So I've got to be able to keep up with Victor Davis Hanson on the 11th floor of the tower. I'm not, I'm an American historian, so it helped me bone up on the classics, but also the way Griegel describes how to think about strategy is just brilliant. And then I got to recommend another one too. Another visiting fellow, Zach Shore, his book, This Is Not Who We Are, America's Struggle Between Vengeance and Virtue. A lot of the research he did was right at the Hoover Archive about Herbert Hoover. And what he describes, and is so compelling in the book, perfect for this holiday Christmas season here, is how Americans after World War II made sacrifices so that they could send food to Europe and prevent the starvation of their former enemies. And he tells stories about the food train going across the country, how American distilleries shut down for a month so that wheat could be shipped over to Europe. And of course, Herbert Hoover was running that relief effort. So anyway, two great books by two Hoover visiting fellows.
Mm-hmm. John Cochrane, best book you read in 2022.
Bill Graham, Early and Eklund, The Myth of American Inequality. This is a great book. It's an easy read. Don't worry. It's not full of equations and charts and graphs, just enough charts and graphs, easy to read ones, unlike my books, which have too much of all of those. Everything you thought about inequality was wrong for a very simple reason. All the numbers ignore taxes and transfers. When you count the fact that rich people pay a lot of taxes and poor people get a lot from the government, inequality is way better than you think. There's a myth that the quote middle class is doing worse than it was in the 1970s. That is also false. Documented how much it is true that among lower income Americans, you work more, you learn an extra dollar, they take away $1 worth of benefits. That's in there as well. All very clearly explained. A great read. It deserves. It's being completely ignored by mainstream media or whatever. But this is a really important one, and it's not. It is so tempting to write this in deep statistical mumbo jumbo. This one's very clearly written, beautiful, convincing. Go get a copy.
Neil, when you're not writing, and what little time you have to actually read a book, what did you read in 2022 that stood out?
Well, one must always spend more time reading than writing. That's very important. I know people who do rather the opposite. I can't talk about my reading experience in 2022 without talking about Thomas Hardy. I immersed myself in Hardy's writing. It began with, I think I've mentioned it on the show before, Return of the Native. Then I read or reread Far from the Madding Crowd. And then for the first time, I read Jude the Obscure, which is one of the most agonizing tragedies in English literature. And these books gave me so much solace, so much consolation this year, which has been a tough year in many ways. For all of us, these books gave me enormous amounts of solace. They're extraordinarily beautifully written, and Hardy was a genius. He also understood something about history, which is really important, and that is that very small things can have huge consequences. Small decisions, little mistakes, that's central, particularly to Jude the Obscure, have enormous life-altering consequences. That's the most important thing that most historians don't properly understand about the way that history works.
Okay. H.R. McMaster, you're a man who literally is meant to play Santa Claus because you're a jolly old soul. What is a holiday tradition in the McMaster household?
Hey, we just get the whole family together, and then we host Christmas Eve here at our home, and then we go to my sister-in-law and brother-in-law's house, and we have family coming in from Philadelphia, so my sister's coming, so it's going to be a great time. And we everything's renewed with grandchildren. I mean, being a grandparent is the best, because you get to just view Christmas through their joyful eyes, and it's just a great time.
Yeah, for the record, I work for H.R. McMaster in my spare time. John, what's a Cochran holiday tradition?
Well, unfortunately, our best ones left the house with the children. My favorite memory, though, is we would typically go cut down our own tree, which involved driving out to the very bleak cornfields of Illinois, finding a Christmas tree farm, spending most of the day out there while we argued over which was the perfect tree, and stopping for hot cocoa on the way home. That one's gone, but one that does remain is the cooking of the famous my mother's and her parents and whatever family Christmas cookies. It's a German recipe. Guests look at them and say, "I'm not eating that," because they look like little slightly burned squares. But trust me, you taste one of Grandma Lydia's famous Christmas cookies, you will be finishing the bowl.
And Neil, the Ferguson household.
Well, we're extremely eccentric because an absolutely central tradition of Christmas is going to church. I think the English experience of Christmas is different from the American because we don't have Thanksgiving. And so all that Americans put into Thanksgiving is also put into Christmas in England. And England has the most exquisite aesthetics. When you go to, for example, an Oxford college to hear carols sung at night, perhaps a night like the one tonight when there's snow on the ground and fog in the air, there's an exquisite magic to the sound and to the spectacle. And I'm extremely excited about the prospect of showing this to my youngest children this year and introducing them to that magical element. It's magical about Christmas. That for me is the central thing about it. And turkey be damned.
Okay.
I just want to put in a plug for what Neil just said, because I'm a deep non-church goer in my adult life, but I do remember going to churches, especially if you can go to a church in Europe, a cathedral where it's cold and it's dark, and think about people have been doing this for 2,000 years every Christmas. Kind of it brings you in touch with your history, even if you're not a believer.
Well, if Neil were traveling so much, I suggest a GoodFellows Boxing Day.
Well, Boxing Day is a special event in our family because it's also the birthday of my son Thomas, and so there'll be a grand gathering of the family to celebrate that on Boxing Day. He's also being initiated into another great British tradition. He's going to see Arsenal play in London, about which he's immensely excited. And now all serious Arsenal fans know that the World Cup is a mere interruption of the much more serious business of the Premier League. And as Arsenal were at the top of the Premier League just before the World Cup, we're itching to get back to serious football and get this World Cup over with. I mean, who's interested anymore anyway?
Okay, let's discuss briefly what each of you hopes to accomplish in 2023. HR, a book.
Yeah, I really do want to get this damn book done. So, I got a love-hate relationship going with it right now. So
tell the folks what the book is.
So this book is about my time as National Security Advisor, and it's the book that I said in Battlegrounds. Hey, this is in Battlegrounds. I said this is the book, not the book people wanted me to write. They wanted me to write the memoir up front, but of course. I felt that would have been, kind of a violation of trust as a national security advisor. I couldn't say what readers would want to know about that experience, but I want the book to last. I wanted to place my experience in broader historical perspective. And answer some questions people might have, like what the heck does a national security advisor do? Why is it important? What's an effective national security decision-making process? So I'm doing a fair bit of research. It's not just based on my recollection of events, and I hope it'll be a worthwhile read.
John, what's on your bucket list for 2023?
We don't make great media here because we're so boring. Finish up the old book project. There's a lot that needs to be built on with it. A lot of marketing the book, but also talking to people, seeing it's a foundation on where you go. So trying to establish the where you go next. And then I have my next book project ready to be started.
Okay. And Neil?
I'm going to finish volume 2 of the biography of Henry Kissinger, which I've been working on for much longer than HR's been working on his book, I have to admit. I was asked what the subtitle of the book was going to be by a Chinese journalist. The first volume was, of course, called The Idealist. And so the obvious subtitle for the second volume would be The Realist, but it's not going to be called The Realist.
We should all try GPT-3 on it, Neil. Write a biography of Henry Kissinger in the style of Niall Ferguson. I'll try. Write the definitive work on inflation.
I believe AI is going to replace me if somebody can give it.
I don't, but I think it's going to replace romance novelists.
If it's going to replace me, it has to take all the data that I've accumulated over the years about the life of Henry Kissinger and turn it into a book. When it can do that, I'll hang up my gloves with resignation and acceptance.
Condensing knowledge may do well. What does the biology literature say about X? But it can't go out of the median. It can't go out of the range. So I think you're still going to be useful.
My retrospective on 2022 was the median retrospective on 2022, as you will see when we post it.
And is the goal, Neil, to get the book out by May 27th?
I can get it finished by then. I don't think it's humanly possible to get it published by then. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, that of course will be his centenary. I'm motivated to write this book. It took a while to find the motivation. In fact, I wrote 2 books in between volume 1 and volume 2, The Square and the Tower, and then Doom. But I've now understood that the real point of the book is explaining what détente was and what it was for, and I think that hasn't been fully understood. So that's the goal. It's not my most important goal for 2023. I think that is to be a better husband, a better father, a better son. I think if I had to, do GoodFellows under oath, I'd say that's really what I'll be striving for next year. But yeah, I got to get the book finished for sure.
Amen, Neil.
Very good. 2 final questions, gentlemen. First of all, the obvious choice for 2023 person of the year will be Zelensky yet again. But again, if we want to gamble and not put out the obvious money on Zelensky, where would you put your chips? HR?
Gosh, I'm Masa Amini and the Iranian people.
John?
I'm going to quote from Neil, who's quoting from, I forget which British Prime Minister. Events, dear boy, events.
And Neil, give us a good 8 to 10 to 1 shot on person of the year, non-Zelensky.
Well, I was debating who was the world spirit on horseback. This was Hegel's famous description of Napoleon. Is there a Napoleon in our time? And I replied, there is. It's NapolElon. Because Musk is in so many ways the towering figure of our time. Think of it this way: not only are we talking about him with respect to Twitter, but during the war in Ukraine in its opening phase, it became clear that he was playing a decisive role there too, because without Starlink terminals, the Ukrainian war effort would probably not have been sustainable. So although he's been person of the year probably at least once, if not twice before, I think one can't really look away from the fact that he is the nearest thing to Napoleon, hence NapolElon. I came up with that and I'm proud of it, and I'm gonna copyright it here and now. He is the spirit of the age, but not on horseback, in a Tesla.
And Neil, how does he prevent Twitter from becoming his Ukraine?
I don't know. I remember Sam Lesson saying in an essay that must be 5 years old because I quoted it in The Square and the Tower, that if one had completely unlimited free speech in the age of the internet, the result would be a hellscape. And I think that's probably right. And I think, in a sense, owning a hellscape is perhaps what's been achieved here. The thing about being Napoleon is Waterloo. One must never forget that you do end up at some point at Waterloo.
Well put. All right, final question for you, gentlemen. Let's end it on a very H.R. McMaster note: an officer and a gentleman and an eternal optimist. I'd like to go around the horn here and have each of you explain to me reasons for optimism in the holiday season and the year ahead. HR, you're the resident optimist. Why don't you go first?
Hey, well, I think 2023 is going to be a really bad year for authoritarian regimes and a good year for democracies. It's not going to be easy in democracies, especially if we tip into recession and so forth. But I think that these authoritarian regimes that look so strong from the outside and in their own propaganda are actually quite brittle.
Mm-hmm. John?
I'll go with the healing properties of democracies and our institutions. I think a new leader of the Republicans will emerge that will not be Donald Trump, and the Republicans will get out of that. And there's very interesting people there. I'm beginning to see peak wokeness at universities, although that battle might be still in the middle of Russia, not yet on its way to Waterloo. But nonetheless, the signs of resistance are starting. So our capacity for reform, after we try everything else, may finally spring forth in this year.
And Neil, you get the last word. Reasons for hope.
Well, there are some years that are just quite boring and not terribly much happens, and everybody can just concentrate on their private lives. That's something you get when you read Tolstoy's masterpiece, War and Peace. I'm hoping that 2023 will be one of those peace years rather than a war year, a year when things will be better just because they can't be quite as bad as this year. I could imagine that, in John's domain, as we all agree, inflation's probably going to be lower next year, absent some other great shock. It's hard to see how the war in Ukraine could continue at the intensity we've seen this year. I mean, both sides simply don't have the wherewithal to sustain that kind of a war, so it probably becomes a less bloody conflict, rather like the Korean War became less bloody over time. And so I'm going to take the view that not every year can be an annus horribilis. And on that simple law of historical averages, 2023 will be one of those quiet years which allow you to focus on the important things like your family.
I had, as an economist, we look at long-run growth. Long-run growth depends on innovation. So what we just saw with ChatGPT-3 is really revolutionary, not in something you'll see next year, but there are the underlying discoveries are still there. The AI is starting to work. After 40, 50 years, the AI is starting to work. Biology still, although horrendously restrained by all sorts of bureaucratic problems, the fact that we can design vaccines in a weekend, gene editing is coming along. The foundations for 10 to 20 years of incredible prosperity are there. We have that opportunity, and seeing that happen, I think, is one. Suppose you could be there the year Gutenberg discovered the printing press. You wouldn't see a lot that year, but it's awfully nice to know that's going on.
Let me add a couple of thoughts here. During the holiday season, take a moment, if you have family and friends, embrace them. Thank them for the love and support. Secondly, if you're in good health, relish it. Go out and do something physical, vigorous. Go ski, go run, go fly a glider, John Cochrane. Enjoy the fact that you can be outdoors and be vigorous. And then finally, take inventory. We spent a lot of time on the show talking about people in very difficult situations, nations under attack, people living under totalitarian regimes. That's not the way in the free world, so be thankful for that. And I'm personally thankful, gentlemen, for the time I get to spend with you most weeks on GoodFellows. It is always an honor and a privilege to be in your company. I hope each of you has a great holiday, and I hope everybody watching the show also has a great holiday as well. And we will see you in 2023. Thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring H.R. McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.